It's my pleasure to announce Dr. Coleman Dennehy tonight. He's a longtime associate and friend. We met at the Commission conference in London in 2015, I think.
That's right,
it was the anniversary of the Magna Carta.
Yep.
Coleman teaches at the Dundalk Institute of Technology, Department of Humanities. He teaches various legal history disciplines. His main areas of research are parliamentary history on the one hand, and there he is now Director of Publications in the International Commission for Parliamentary and Representative Institutions, and I encourage you to look up the Commission's journal and other publications. It's called Parliament's Estates and Representation, and he also does criminal law and criminology, and his lecture today is going to concern that, and I think you will find it very interesting.
Fingers crossed.
I'm going to share the presentation. I hope everyone sees this both online and offline. So you can just move the arrow.
All good.
Everything. So Coleman, once again, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here in person. Coleman gave one lecture on the forum already, but during COVID and we were all online. It was still very interesting. You can look that up on YouTube. And Coleman gave one lecture in person, but not at the forum, at the Historia student conference 2 years ago. And that was also very interesting. And we are very happy to have him here again.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
We're looking forward to it.
So thank you very much to Nina and to the management of the law faculty, and also to yourselves for coming out on a Friday evening. It's very unnerving for a lecturer in Ireland to even consider the idea that students would be willing to come out and listen to, of all things, a legal history lecture. But I'm very pleased to see that the state of student curiosity in Belgrade is in such a healthy state. So I'm very grateful for your time this evening. I come from the southwest of Ireland originally, and so sometimes my accent is not always easily comprehensible. And also the fact that I'm guessing probably most of you, English is not your first language. I imagine it's Serbian. So if at any point I'm speaking too fast, if I use terminology that you don't understand, or if my accent becomes unintelligible, please let me know, and I'll try my best to make myself understood as well as I can. So we have the talk here on Ireland. It's a common law country. It's the very far side of Europe from here. It's probably about as far away from Serbia as you can get and still be within Europe, maybe Iceland. It's focused primarily on the early modern period, and in Ireland we consider early modern to be 15th and 16th century, and maybe the 18th century as well. So the period in particular of religious reform, which has influence on the way we think about crime and punishment, because what you can see in the picture above is 3 bishops and 1 monk being executed. Now this is a creation, this image, from, I think probably from the area we now call today Belgium, where there's a lot of Irish colleges and there's a propaganda factory giving out information. And what we don't see below is the Latin text, which translates roughly as, this is what the Calvinists are doing to our Catholic bishops in Ireland. And there's equatable propaganda that's been used by Protestant propagandists, talking about just how cruel the Spaniards are, or whoever else the groups might be. And so here we see one bishop having his feet roasted. That takes an iron boot, where his foot is pushed into the boot. It's filled with oil and it's held over a fire. And the description I won't read out to you, but it's incredibly violent. At the top, that's taking place in the late 1570s. The scene at the top is December 1612, where another bishop is executed. He's actually executed in a different way, but I'm pretty sure I know who he is. And over there's the Bishop of Mayo, also from the Middle Eastern time. So they're executed 30, 40 years apart. So the image is purely, like I say, one, to help people understand what is going on in Ireland at the time. And that plays into a perception that traditionally a lot of Irish people have had, including Irish historians, that English governance in Ireland, the colonial government in Ireland, is inherently violent. And there's many generations and centuries of historical thought that has confirmed that as a simple fact. And it's not one that I'm necessarily disagreeing with tonight, even though I am pointing out there's few executions taking place. What I think probably happens is that we see a state that can be very violent, and during times of war, and even during times of peace where there's martial law available, military law, martial law, I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, is military law. It's law that's used during wartime, which permits an officer, for example, to execute people on the spot, if needs be, within the bounds of legality. And what we find in Ireland, sometimes martial law is used, in some cases 30, 40 years after the end of a conflict. But what I'm talking about tonight is going to be looking at not special people like bishops or political figures. Instead, what I'm concerning myself with is what we might call the ODCs, the ordinary decent criminals, non-political figures, non-religious figures, people from the community, just regular criminals as such. And the point I'm going to try to make to you tonight is that whilst the state is a very violent state, when it's engaging in sort of statecraft and state building and warfare, in the run-of-the-mill, the regular community reaction to crime is actually very soft. So whilst there's lots of bloodshed in Ireland, I'm going to try and make the point that the community and sometimes the state conspires to be actually quite humane in ways that maybe traditionally we haven't thought about the world 300 or 400 years ago. We've traditionally had a sense that, and I suspect maybe it's the same in Serbian historical thought, that in the past, a very arrogant sense from people in the Enlightenment or the 19th or the 20th century that humanity is on a straight line of progress, that the Middle Ages are awful, abusive, violent, miserable, and that as we come closer to the modern age, society becomes more refined, we become better as a society, we become technologically more advanced, and we're happier as a people. I think that's not true. I don't think it's true for Ireland. I suspect it's not true for large parts of Europe. And I think that our reaction towards crime and violence is such that we see a criminal justice system that is actually quite humane in the 17th century, and compare that with the so-called modern age of mid-20th century. And I think you know what happens in the middle of the 20th century. The Balkans know it better than most. It's an incredibly violent age. It's incredibly destructive. The loss of life is unprecedented. And if that's what modernity is, I'm not sure I want to be part of it, to be quite honest. And I think we need to learn from that. But the arrogance of the modern age to think that everything that went before us is backward and retrograde and lesser than the world we live in today is not necessarily the case. And so I'm going to question some of these ideas in this talk. So I'm just going to give you an example of one event that took place in 1663. I'm editing a diary at the moment of the wealthiest man in Ireland. He's probably, in fact, one of the wealthiest men in Ireland, England, and Scotland. So he's very, very wealthy. His father arrived in Ireland with one pair of trousers, 2 shirts, 1 jacket, 1 dagger, 1 sword, and a purse with about 30 coins. Almost nothing. And he died the wealthiest man in the country. He is the ultimate symbol of a colonial man on the make. And for English people coming into Ireland, there is a prospect of unbelievable riches, almost indescribable riches. And this man is powerful. His name is Burlington. That's his English title. He's the Earl of Cork in Ireland. And his nephew, he writes in his diary, I went after dinner to Clonmel. It's a place in Ireland. My nephew Loftus, that's the name of his nephew, on trial for his life, being to be on Wednesday. Next Wednesday, my nephew's on trial for his life. He kills a man, he has a row with somebody, and he kills him. So maybe a case not all that uncomfortable. Later on, my nephew Loftus came to his trial for the killing of Ensign Bromley and was by the jury found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. There's a distinction in common law that a murder is what they call is murder by malice prepense. It comes from an old French term, penser, to think. So where you've planned it in advance, it's a murder. But if it's just a fight, things get out of hand, you hit somebody, it kills them, but it's not your intention to kill them, it counts as a manslaughter. So he goes from murder, which is a death sentence in Ireland, and a very violent death sentence. It's not just hanging, it's hanging, drawing, and quartering. I was talking to somebody today, and he suggested that lots of people in Serbia have seen the film Braveheart, Scottish film, right? You've seen at the very end when he's executed. He's hung up for a time and still alive. He's cut down. He's placed on a kind of a wooden table in the shape of a cross. They take a knife and they cut him from here all the way down to his private parts. They cut off his private parts. They pull his insides out while he's still alive. They burn them in the fire. And they cut off his head and put it on a spike. And they cut his body into 4 separate parts and they hang it from the gates. And it's retributive violence. So it's punishment to bring pain to somebody who's caused pain, and it's also a symbolic emasculation of a man. Cutting off his private parts is the ultimate in taking away a man's masculinity. And it's humiliation, and obviously it's extremely painful. That's for a murder, not just a hanging. And that's different in Ireland. In England, it's simply hanging for regular murder. In Ireland, it's that extra awful punishment. So, for an indictment for murder, he's guilty of manslaughter. The law demands for a manslaughter, you're not actually hanged, you're not killed, you're simply burnt in the hand. And that means a hot iron is taken out of a fire, and maybe the letter M for manslaughter, so that you get to commit a manslaughter once, but if you commit it a second time, you will be punished. If you're a thief, if you've stolen things, it's a T. It goes on your hand. So when you hold up your hand to swear on the Bible, everybody sees. Blasphemy, it's B. Sometimes for blasphemy, because it's offensive to God, not just to man, it goes there. Okay? And so his punishment goes from hanging, drawing, and quartering down to be burnt in the hand, and also to losing his goods, his wealth. And later on then, a few months later, there's an order for the suspension of all these sentences by the remission of the king, whose pardon is certainly expected, but the only thing is the weather is holding it up, coming from London over to Dublin. And then later on, we get the official writing that he's not to be burnt in the hand. So effectively, no punishment. Now, if I said to you in the modern age in Serbia or in Ireland, a very wealthy man or the nephew of an extremely wealthy man got himself into trouble, should we be surprised he doesn't get punished? Most of you, if you believe in egalitarianism and you think it's important, will probably say, of course, we would have expected that. The wealthy always get off, the powerful always get off. I would argue, potentially, I think, and I'm not 100% convinced, but I think I can convince you tonight, I would think that this is not exceptional. In fact, it's typical. And it's not just the wealthy who get off. We've got widespread connivance between the system and the community to avoid killing other people. It's a complex sort of a statement, because at one point I'm saying the state is violent, and I think it is in terms of warfare, but when the community are involved, and especially when we take time to think about the sentence, so a martial law commissioner will frequently come along, he holds the trial without even getting off his horse. And he just says, this guy's clearly guilty, string him up, and he can be just hung from the local tree. Whereas when you go to jail, you wait for the judges to come, everybody has time to think, our pressure drops, our anger drops, and we think more about what a death sentence actually means. And the longer it takes to come to trial, and the longer it takes after your trial for a sentence to be carried out, I think it's less likely that you're going to see the sentence actually carried out. Because ultimately, humans, not just today, we're not just the only humane people in history, we have humane people in the past who probably think it's wrong to kill and that it's an unfortunate it's an unfortunate outcome to what is a difficult circumstances. Young men are always fighting. I'm sure if I go down the town tonight, somebody will have a lot of drink. I'll see a fight in Belgrade. I definitely will in Dublin. Do you know? And it's not surprising. It happens. Sometimes women fight as well. Men probably more likely. A little bit of background really quickly. Ireland is a colony. I know in modern age, we tend to think of colonies more as being what Europeans might do in Africa or South America or Asia. In 1169, Ireland becomes a colony of England. The Anglo-Normans, people who are French originally, go to England, and about 2 generations or 3 generations later, they arrive in Ireland. And they bring with them a legal system, the common law. They bring with them a language, which initially is kind of a Norman French and later on becomes English. They bring with them, Irish people might say, a certain amount of arrogance as to things like language, things like dress, that Irish men dress differently to Englishmen, and that ultimately, because Englishmen are civilized, I'm going to use the word civilized a lot, it should have magic quote marks beside it. So if I don't do them, remember that I don't mean civilized in the way that people may have used it in the past. And so if you're an Irishman dressed as an Irishman, you therefore must be uncivilized. And they use the law to regulate civilization. Okay? So there are laws to say you can dress like this, you cannot dress like that. Sumptuary law. And it's a mark of your civilization. The way you wear your hair. Albrecht Dürer, the German sketch and etching artist, he does a picture of Irish soldiers on the continent in the 16th century, and it looks very much like they're described in law. That certain ways Irishmen wear moustaches, Englishmen don't at the time. Therefore, it's a mark of civilization. Language, family. It's very interesting to note that when you read travel journals in Ireland around the time of Englishmen traveling in Ireland, they'll always comment, for instance, on clothing. Irish women dress in a way that's considered by English travellers as being vulgar. They show too much of their body. They sometimes are wearing a top that reveals too much cleavage, or they sometimes show parts of their body that English people at the time might think is vulgar. And again, this is a mark of civilization. It's every aspect of life. Ireland is also seen as a blank canvas. Like a lot of people who go to Africa in the 19th century, they say, there's nothing here. This is virgin land. We can take this. We're not taking it from anybody. Because these Irish people are uncivilized, we don't have a responsibility to treat them fairly. We can take their land, and it's justified because we are civilized, they are not. It's just like what people are saying in the 19th century, or what the Spaniards are saying in the 16th century when they go to Mexico, or places like that. So it's a blank canvas. We can start from scratch. We have a new Ireland, and we can do anything we want. We can do it right in ways that it was never done right before. And it's also a troubled isle. Ireland, like I say, has a series of rebellions throughout the 16th and the 17th century, frequently extremely violent rebellions. And it means that Ireland is never settled. It's always in the process of settling, but it never really settles until at least the 18th century. So it's violent. There's always a risk of violence erupting. And the state reacts to this threat of violence with even more violence. From the mid-1500s, state violence rises considerably during the age. And it's not, what I'm suggesting here is that a civilizing power like England actually does very barbarous things. It behaves itself in a most uncivilized manner. It is in itself an absolute contradiction. And so to a point, the law as a civilizing movement becomes part of this process. That we have to consider that the law is meant to help civilize people in the way that it does today. We have law because we don't like the idea of young men down the town beating each other up when they've had too much to drink. So the law is established to make sure that violence doesn't break out, that our society remains controlled. And this is everything from traffic law to interpersonal violence, to sexual violence, to everything else in between. It has to affect us all because ultimately the state wants to have a compliant civilian population that behaves itself and doesn't run amok, because otherwise we get chaos and we get lawlessness and the state breaks down if people don't buy into it. But ultimately, most people have to buy into that system of criminal justice, because we can all agree it's wrong to murder somebody. And we all agree, I think generally, that we should be punished if we do it, or if we take somebody else's goods. There's occasions sometimes where maybe we won't agree. Some people will say, I don't think you should be criminalized if you smoke drugs, if you smoke marijuana. Relatively speaking, who's been harmed? Is it harmful? Maybe a little bit. Any more harmful than smoking cigarettes or drinking whiskey? Maybe, maybe not. So we may not all agree on that, but on the big things we can agree, I think, generally speaking, that shouldn't be a problem. So the law is being used as a civilizing movement, but it's being used by a state that's doing very, very violent things. So I think one of the reasons why we see a reluctance on people to execute are probably things that are maybe obvious to us today. That it's a fairly obvious point to make, but when a death sentence is carried out, the condemned person is dead. It's an absolute punishment that ultimately you can't come back from the dead unless, like a lady called Anne Green in Oxford in the 1650s, she's condemned to death, she is hanged, her body is cut down, and about 4 hours later she's found to be breathing. And so they don't know what to do with her because sentence has been carried out and she's been confirmed as dead, but ultimately she's not. But otherwise, most people who are hanged die. Obvious point, but it's worth saying. Death is end, it's final. Okay? The second point I would make is that people appear to have been squeamish about the idea that even though they're living in a violent place, in a violent time, and violent death is way more common than it is today, ultimately, Irish executions tend to be more bloody, like I say. For murder, the punishment also for arson is a hanging, drawing and quartering. It's not just a hanging. I know you're dead either way, but if it was me, I know which way I'd prefer to go. It's extremely violent. And as such, then, people are squeamish about killing people in those circumstances. And there's a case to be made, and this is something where modern lawyers and particularly modern politicians would do well to listen, that the more you increase sentences in an effort to get tough on crime, I don't know if there's an equivalent phrase is used in the Serbian parliament, it's used a lot in the Irish one. If we just keep on increasing the time that you spend in prison as a punishment, that ultimately, even though the politician is trying to gain votes by showing how good a politician they are and how much they care about women or vulnerable people or whoever else, that the juries may be reluctant to convict when the sentence is too high. And when you have a situation here where it's extreme violence, as extreme as it gets, we're ultimately left with a jury who's unwilling to convict because the sentence is so extreme and it's counterproductive. The state is actually conspiring against itself to bring those convictions down. It's also the contention of this that a death sentence was usually uncalled for, and that the public, the administrative state, and the legal procedure and the legal community conspired to avoid execution being carried out, either in the courtroom or outside of the courtroom. It seems counterintuitive, but if you bear with me, I'll try to explain what I mean. What this paper is not about ultimately, though, is martial law. I'm not talking about that. It's a very interesting law. There's been very good work written on it in recent years in Ireland, but I'm not talking about soldiers administering law. I'm not talking about massacres either by the state or by insurgents against the state. I'm not talking about people like Oliver Cromwell, who's Ireland's what we might call a boogeyman. He's the most hated man in Ireland for the last 500 years because he's very anti-Catholic, he's very violent, and he kills a lot of people in 2 massacres in Ireland. And he's been promoted by historians in the 19th century as our most hated figure. There are lots of other people like him, but he's our one. I'm sure there's an equivalent in Serbia that you could probably name. I'm not talking about dead priests. I'm talking about what I call the ODC, the ordinary decent criminal. By that I mean regular crimes committed by regular people, not political crimes, not crimes as part of a rebellion, not necessarily aristocrats, just normal people, the people who sometimes are left behind by historians because we don't have the source material around them, or we don't take an interest in the lives of the poor. But for me, I think they're very interesting because ultimately these people are quite involved. Now, as you can see, The criminal justice system punishment is divided into three parts in Ireland, or there's three categories of crime. There's treason at the top, which is traditional treason, which is a crime against the state or a crime against the monarch, or maybe a crime against a diplomat or a judge or a soldier who's on active duty. In Ireland, up until recently, it was effectively a treason to kill a policeman. The punishment now is 40 years. For a regular murder in Ireland, you'll probably do about 19 or 20 years. It's double the punishment because it's somebody who's actively putting themselves in danger on behalf of the state for the good of the community generally, and thus it's an extra egregious offence against them because it's an offence against the state, not just against the individual. Now, whether that's justified or not is another issue. Is the life of a policeman more precious than the life of a nurse or a law professor or anybody else? There's an argument to be made there. Below treasons, and treason includes murder and arson, which is strange for a treason, but in Ireland, this law comes in say, 1495, where they contend that Irish people don't take the punishment for murder seriously enough, a traditional hanging, which to me seems unlikely. We need to get tough on crime, so we're going to bring in hanging, drawing, and quartering. But after those ones are regular felonies, as we call them, are the serious crimes that come before a jury in what we call a circuit trial, where professional judges go around the country and hear cases. And for almost all of them, the judgment for all of these felonies is death by death to be hanged. And below them, we have misdemeanors, which are your relatively low-level crimes, which are held in local courts with local justices, non-professional judges. And today, they're crimes that are held in the local courts by the lowest rung of the judiciary profession, the district court judges, and mostly without any jury attached. And they're for little things like parking fines, like public urination, like drunk and disorderly, things that are relatively more of a nuisance than a genuine kind of violence harm to individuals. Crime statistics, this to just give you a sense. These are administrative regions of Ireland called counties. They vary in size. And in the early years, were soon after the arrival of British colonisation into Ulster, the northern part of Ireland, mostly made up of the modern state of Northern Ireland. And as you can see, capital sentence, even though everybody who comes before the court, in some cases 20, 30, 40 cases, in some cases even more, the numbers where a capital sentence is handed down is sometimes small. Okay, admittedly 4 is large or 5, but nobody's sentenced to death. One person sentenced to death. Nobody's sentenced to death. In Tipperary in the 1660s, which is a reasonably well-populated county, of the first 231 cases or hearings that come before the court, just one person is sentenced to death. So what I would contend in this paper is that if you come before the court, even if it's on a felony, you're coming to be tried for your life, the chances of you actually dying at the hands of the state is absolutely very small, I think. Now, most of the evidence that I'm coming across, I think, backs up that contention. Our sources in Ireland are never perfect, so we don't have a perfect picture of what's happening, but from what we can tell, it suggests that that's something along the case there. That is obviously not legible to you. It's probably not even legible to me. I'll just show you. These are the dates, these are the complainants, that's the gender. These are the offences that are listed. I can just about make them out here. This is a rural part of Ireland, so animal theft is a very common crime. But there's also things like breaking and entering. There's robbery and larceny from a home. There's people being bound over to keep the peace. There's a bit of riot. There's some religious crime groups like Quakers, who are kind of Protestants in Ireland who have just arrived, but they're very mistrusted by the state. And then these are the complainants, men and women. These are the sentences and the punishments in particular. And these are all felonies. In theory, many of these can be a death sentence. 3 months in the House of Correction. Confined until Saturday next, not a very long sentence. To be whipped. Claiming benefit of clergy. This is just an example I've picked out, but there's no death sentence there, even though I have maybe, 40 cases, 50 cases, no death sentence showing up. The way the system works in Ireland, like many common law countries, and In many respects, not all that different to today. In many respects, we don't have a grand jury anymore, but the Americans still have them because they come from that common law system. I would suggest that at every stage of the process, there is a potential for the accused person who may well be guilty. Lots of them are, I'm quite sure, but huge numbers of them escape. At detection or capture, obviously, we know if you study modern criminal law, probably more importantly criminology, that most people, I would suggest, commit crime. We are all criminals in this room. I certainly am. I bet all of you are as well. I'm not suggesting you're all murderers, but we've all committed crime. We've all walked across the road when the green man is not there. We've maybe drank beer when we're teenagers. If you're not allowed by law, you're certainly not in Ireland. Maybe some of you engaged in drug taking, a little bit of violence maybe as teenagers, maybe even now. Other things, maybe you drive over the speed limit. Most of us are not captured by the police. Most of us are not.
I think we've all used the pirate in something at some point.
Well, but I was going to say, please don't admit to anything. A friend of mine is doing a big study on smuggling, and she is interviewing people, and she has to regularly say, please do not admit to anything criminal, because we had a big problem in Ireland with this at some time back. Is there a question?
Sir, I wanted to add on to what Professor said. Since some companies started policies where owning the game copies isn't technically owning the entire season, stealing.
Well, the other thing is, I suppose, attached to crime, we might ask, have we harmed people? And there is a case to be said that you might be breaking the law, but you may not be committing a harm. You may not be morally responsible for damage. Damage to a very wealthy man's balance, who cares, to a point. And I'd agree with that to a point. At the point of indictment, where the paperwork gets written up, at the point of a grand jury is a preliminary jury, usually with about 15 or 17 members, and they don't make a judgment of guilt or not guilt. They simply decide that there's enough preliminary evidence or prima facie evidence for a trial to go ahead. So they're just having a hearing to saying there might be something in this, and they can put you forward for trial, or they can return a billa ignoramus, which means that we know nothing, there's nothing here. Nothing to answer. At a trial where you can either plead guilty, and you might ask, why would you plead guilty in a felony if everybody is executed? I would suggest if you plead guilty, you might be gaining the favour of the court. You might be more successful later on in getting a pardon because you've essentially thrown yourself at the mercy of the court. Or else you go to trial by jury, and I'll show you lots of examples where I think juries try their best to get people off crimes. And then later, at verdict, and at sentence, and at punishment, there's all ways whereby we can escape the noose, I think, as they go. I'll show you some examples of why I think this happens. In 17th century Ireland, we have uncooperative juries. All of these are statements by people in power who are saying juries can't be tried. Do you have jury trials in Serbia?
Not like in common law.
Okay.
Co-jurors who sit with judges. So
Yeah.
There can be like 3 judges, 4 jurors. And
Okay. So since 1215, it's been law in Ireland, connected to but not really at the origins of Magna Carta, that no man should be jailed, disseised, or punished without judgment by 12 common men. And this is the basis for jury trial that we still use in Ireland today. It's under attack in England at the moment, increasingly because of backlogs in the courts. The Labour government is trying to do away with jury trials for some of the lesser crimes, and people are very upset about it. In Ireland, we still use them for serious crimes. For less serious ones, we don't. But if you opt, even at the most smallest crimes, you can opt to be put forward for a jury trial. But the problem with that is you can get a higher sentence as a result. So you take a risk, you take a chance. But the problem is, if we were to create a new legal system today, where people may be on trial for their lives, or you may potentially be going to jail for 2 decades, for 20 years for a murder. If I said, let's get 12 random strangers in who know nothing about the law, who might be suffering from mental illness, who might be angry, who might be upset, who might be depressed, who might be uninterested, who might be scrolling on their phone all the time, and let's get them to decide this matter, you would say, absolutely not. It's like me, imagine if I said, let's get 12 randomers in off the street and let them mark all the student essays. You'd say, absolutely no way, of course not. Yet, for some reason, we think it's a good way to judge people for their lives. We use it because we've always used it, but ultimately, when you actually think about it, it's crazy in some ways. Having said that, we're still very wedded to it, I think because it's part of our legal tradition, and it would be very difficult to get rid of it. And I must say, for all of its faults, and I've sat on juries myself, and I've returned verdicts, I still think it's probably a decent idea the way that we do it. But here we find people giving out saying juries don't play the game. And that's the problem with bringing people in off the street to judge. They don't always, they've got nothing to lose by finding guilty or not guilty. They don't have a vested interest, so they won't always do what the state tells them. If this was the judges alone, they'd all find guilty, but because we're inviting members of the community, and in some ways it's not a bad way, we're still in the period that local people are acting as juries, so it's potentially the case that some of the jurors will know the accused. They may already be familiar with some of the facts of the case. We're still not arriving at an independent jury that is unknown. The partialities of jurors we find to be a great impediment to the ordinary course of justice, which we conceive to be occasioned chiefly by their obstinacy and inconformity in religion. That basically means Catholics can't be trusted, according to these Protestant governors. The subtlety of these people blunted the effect of the common law, as people will not find a bill of indictment in the evidence never so pregnant, even when the evidence is overwhelmingly. And this is the case where you might get a very liberal lawyer. There was one very famous character in a comedy in the 1970s called Rumpole of the Bailey. And he always said, it doesn't matter what the facts say, it doesn't matter what the judge tells you, you have to decide whether you're performing justice. And sometimes justice and facts and law aren't always the same things. So it's maybe something to keep in mind as we go, that sometimes a jury will say no, even though it's clearly yes. Evidence from the Jesuit letters suggests that juries regularly refuse to find against Catholics who were being punished on the basis of their religion, that the community was deciding, we are not agreeing with this, we're not going along with this process. Look here, we find, for example, in the town of Coleraine, right up on the north coast of Ireland, that the jurors are to pay fines of £100. That's huge money back in the day, massive money, and to be pilloried at Dublin at the next assize, and each of them are to lose one of their ears for acquitting traitors to the clear evidence that they were in open rebellion. So the state is saying these people are so clearly guilty, and the jury is so clearly not taking its responsibility seriously, that they need to be pilloried. A pillory, you might have seen it in movies sometimes, it's a large plank of wood with 3 holes, one for your head and one for your arms, and you're inserted like this. And what happens in terms of losing their ears, it's exactly what they say. In Ireland, they take a nail, they take a hammer, and they hammer your ear to the pillory. And then what they'll tend to do is leave a knife there, and you can walk away anytime you want, but you gotta cut your ear off. And that happens on occasion. In Cork, on one occasion, people were hanged without a jury because they didn't possess freehold. That's cut off there, so they're not wealthy people. So they come under the jurisdiction of the martial lawyers. But here, somebody else is put on, the recorder, who's a local lawyer, is put up on trial before the county, so again with the jury, and against the clear evidence and his own confession, the jury acquitted him. So the man on trial confessed, and the jury said, no, we're not buying it. Do you know? So you can see from the state's point of view. Now remember, this is early 17th century or late 16th century. We have ethnicities. One is Irish, overwhelmingly Catholic, and the other is the colonizing power, mostly English, sometimes Scottish, almost always Protestant. So we've got ethnic division. We've got people saying we're civilized and you're not. We've got religious division. So don't be surprised if justice is a victim in these battles. And when you invite the community in, saying, take on our law, become civilized just like us, you'll see all the benefits of becoming English. change your ways, change your language, change your religion, change the way you dress, take on our laws. And the Irish people are saying, no, I don't want it. It's nothing to do with us. It's not for us. We're going to go out of our way to make the system not work as a result. That's an uncooperative jury. At other times, juries might be intimidated. Okay? We see here in 1610, again, soon after the plantation of Ulster is happening. So what we're talking about is colonization at this very time. He found that none within Monaghan could be trusted as jurors because they're intimidated by a local family. The previous elite within the county who have been ousted, people who had been the elite who are no longer the elite, clearly they're not happy with that sort of a situation. So the jury is intimidated against finding against any of them. And we see that clearly within the sense. Sir John Davies, who's the Attorney General, one of the most senior legal officers, says the priests excommunicate jurors who condemn a traitor. The priests tell the people, you're no longer a Catholic if you condemn in this sense. The Irish jurors will never condemn a principal traitor, and therefore we have need of an English colony that we may have honest trials. They dare not condemn an Irish lord of a country for fear of revenge, because we have not yet power enough in the country to defend honest jurors. We must stay them till the English and the Scottish colonies be planted, and then we can make a jury of them. So he's saying in one instance, you know, there was always this project to bring the Irish in, but he's also saying the Irish can't be trusted. We need only English and Scots on those juries, which obviously defeats the purpose of a jury because it's supposed to be a spread of the community. Men and women, different age, different backgrounds, you know. At other times, we see a total disregard for the law, where again the Irish population, I think, are actively working against English common law justice, and they're making a fool of it. And there's a few examples here. In the first instance, it says here, at the sessions in Ulster, all the gentlemen of the common people, excepting the judges' train, excepting the judges who were travelling around, all of the people and the very jurymen who are put upon life and death in all the trials in law, commonly spoke Irish. Many spoke Spanish in Ulster, seems unlikely to me, and few or none could or would speak English, because the trials are held in English. Saying, no speak Inglesi. Sorry, nothing to do with us. Again, refusing to engage with us, and manifestly show their hands. This is another case. When the rebellion breaks out in 1640s, when there's extreme violence, we have a trial that takes place, and it's a mock trial, and I think it's used to show the disregard for English law by the common Irish people. Because what we have is, say, once a jury of women were impanelled and returned against this deponent for trial of his life, amongst which a lady called Catherine Fury, it's a surname in Ireland, but Fury is the perfect name when you think about it, who was forewoman, said she'd be satisfied with no less than the opponent's head because he had been associated with Charles McCooch, who's an unpopular man. So I think that's saying a jury of women. Now, this makes me sound very misogynistic, but in the 17th century, most people thought women should not sit on juries or could not sit on juries or couldn't understand the importance of it. So it's like us sending in pigs to sit on the jury or sending chickens in to sit on the jury. It's seen as so ridiculous that we're literally making a mockery of the whole event. Okay? I'm not joking about sending cattle into courtrooms, because here, to the contempt and derision of English law, did ordinarily and commonly seem to prefer bills of indictment and bring the English breed of cattle to be tried upon juries. And having a fashion arranged these cattle, that the scornful rebels judge the resitting amongst them, that they would say to look as if they could speak English, give them the book and see if they can read. So what they do is they bring in an English cow, a cow that had belonged to an English family or a Protestant cow, and they put him in the box. And they say, he looks like an English cow, I bet he can speak English. And they bring the Bible to him to swear on the Bible. And the cow can't read or refuses to read if he could. He doesn't speak up. And they decide then that pronouncing the words legit and non to the jury, then because the cow stood mute and could not read, that he would and did pronounce judgment and sentence of death against the cow. And they execute the cow because he's an English cow. So they're not so foolish as to think the cow can read. What they're really saying is English law is a joke. It's a shambles. And we're going to treat it as such. We're going to make a joke of it. And it's evidently from some people in the room, it's still funny 400 years after. And I think what they're doing in these things is saying, we don't fear the law, we despise it so much that we just make a joke of it. Do you know? It's clearly a very unpopular legal system within that. We also have conniving juries, a jury who will play along with the game, but who don't want to pass a sentence of death. And I think this is a really interesting case. I'll read out the text because the text might be difficult for you. It's a 17th century hand. And what it says here is, indicted for the felonious stealing of 1 silver beaker to the price of 30 shillings sterling of the goods and chattels of, I can't read the name of the person, on a certain date in Feathered in County Tipperary. So what happens in Ireland in the common law system is, if you steal something worth 12 pence or more, it's a felony, death sentence. If it's less than 12 pence, it's a misdemeanor, in which case you might be whipped or you might be put in the stocks or something like that. Now, they clearly say 30 shillings, okay? So that means that it's worth a huge amount of money. 12 pence, relatively small amount of money. So what happens is, the guy says posse, which is a Latin abbreviation to put yourself on the country or to opt for a jury trial. He says, I'm innocent, I'll go before a jury. And the jury says, guilty, culpabilis, from Latin, guilty. So they say he's guilty, but guilty petty larceny, ad value 11 pence. So they say he's guilty and we want to see him punished, but that beaker, which you say is worth 30 shillings, that much money, is actually worth 11 pence, just mysteriously below the threshold. So they want to see the person punished, but they don't want to see him killed. So what happens is the sentence is to be whipped. That's a good resolution. That even in the 21st century makes sense. We don't want to see an outrageous punishment, and we're not prepared to find him guilty of what he's accused of exactly, but we do want to see him punished because we do think he's a bad man and done a bad thing by stealing something. But we don't agree with a death sentence, but we are happy to see some corporal punishment applied. And to me, that's a very, very interesting case as a result. That's a jury deciding for themselves, this is the way we want to resolve this issue, this case. And so to my mind, that makes an awful lot of sense within that. In one case in England, a colleague of mine from England has looked at a case like this where somebody steals £3 in cash and he's found guilty, and they say, we think it's only worth 11 pence, even though the coins are there. So it's so ridiculous, but it's so explicitly clear that they don't want to see a death penalty applied, which to me is a sign of 17th century civilization. We also have a thing called benefit of clergy. It's a really important case as well. I don't know if any of you are religious. In a Latin Bible, it's Psalm 50, it might be 51 in Bibles in the Orthodox Church, I'm not sure. It's from the book of Psalms, and it says, Misere me Deus secundum magnum miscordiam tuum. It's just one of the Psalms. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, according to the multitude of thy loving mercies. And the deal is, in the Middle Ages, clergy should be tried by spiritual courts of the bishop, and commoners who aren't clergy get tried in the regular crown courts. So the way to define who's a cleric and who is not a cleric in medieval English law is if you can read. So what they do is they give you a book, and it's always the same verse that they point to. Can you read that? And what always happens is, when you're waiting in your cell, somebody says, learn off this line and repeat it when you're asked. And if you can read it out loud, you're officially sent to the spiritual courts where there's no death sentence, there's no punishment really. And it's a way, it's called benefit of clergy. Now, over time, legislation is created to reduce the number of laws that benefit of clergy can apply to, but it's still the case that some people can appeal to benefit of clergy. And this is a way, again, of giving, now it's just a one-off case because you get burned in the hand, okay? But it does mean you get one get-out-of-jail-free card, like in Monopoly. And in this case, indicted for the traitorous and felonious murdering of one Richard, I can't read the surname, giving him a mortal wound with a little knife to the left side of his breast and to the length of 4 inches of breadth and 5 inches of diameter. And it says he goes for trial, not guilty of murder, but guilty of homicide, and then claims benefit of clergy, an officio clericale. And it gets out, and that scope is extended Bad news for women in the early modern period. Women can't be clergy, therefore they can't appeal to benefit of clergy. But in 1634, that law is extended to women wholesale. So it finally, but all the time they're reducing the number of crimes that can allow for benefit of clergy. But this is used on occasion, and it is used well by some people along the way. Another one is called benefit of the belly. If women can't apply for benefit of clergy, men can't apply for benefit of the belly. Benefit of the belly is not for fat people, it's for people who are pregnant, because it's seen as being inconsistent with the values of medieval society to kill a pregnant woman. So it means that we have to allow some provision for pregnant people to be not killed, or at least immediately. And so in this case, it reads that Jane, the late wife of Garrett Comerford, convicted of the disease of murdering her said husband, and judgment thereupon given against her to be drawn and burnt. Women can't be hanged, drawn, and quartered, because it's seen as vulgar to cut a woman up in nude in front of people, so she's burnt instead. And having then demanded the benefit of her belly, and thereupon found by a jury of matrons, women jury, who come in and inspect her and see if she is pregnant, and once they confirm that she's pregnant, she's reprieved and continues in jail ever since. And she gets off, once she's in the second trimester, which is about 3 months in, she can get off until she gives birth. And I suspect, I don't know what happens to her afterwards, but I suspect as part of this, that's what's probably happening, is that her sentence is going to be respited altogether. Because if you kill her, she's already killed her husband, who presumably is the father of the baby, maybe not, but who's going to look after the baby? It goes on the community, the parish. So the community pay for bringing up the child. It's easier to let her live in that case. It's considered to be bad form to kill mothers. Anyway, to execute. And we still see that in Ireland, even in the 20th century. The execution rate of women is much lower than it is for men overall. We also see, I think, as part of this, the growth of what we might call the incarcerative state. It's commonly held, I'll finish up now in a moment because I know we're passing on time. It's commonly held as being part of the situation in Ireland that prisons don't become part of the system until the 19th century. I would argue we have the growth of an incarcerative state from the 16th century, where we get the creation of things called houses of correction. So these aren't just houses to stick poor people in, which we do have. These are specifically called houses of correction, correcting bad behavior. So it can be used for crime, but it can also be used, it's essentially criminalizing poverty. People who are vagabonds or who don't live in a home or associated with a particular farm, who are moving around, who are scary to people in civil society because they are unemployed or they're moving around, and people are fearful of crime, they're fearful of disease and all the usual stuff. And so here, for example, a woman called Catherine Brown is convicted for stealing a sheet from a man called Thomas Smith, and she's to be sent to the House of Correction there to remain for 3 months. 3 months incarceration is the punishment. Traditionally, people used to say jail was somewhere where you kept somebody waiting for trial and then punishment is meted out to them. I'm suggesting instead incarceration is the punishment. It's not just a holding place. So that's kind of like difference between prison and jail, we might argue. That is not uncommon in the 17th century, despite what modern historians think. Modern historians, essentially journalists in many respects, thinks the world starts in 1800 or 1815. They don't realize that we've got things happening beforehand that are actually relevant to the modern state. And I think that's very important to keep in mind as well. We also see a proliferation of pardons. This is a very difficult to read text, a long list of names of people who are pardoned. Now, traditionally, you would say in order to get a pardon, you have to pay for it. The state makes money, they get the profits of justice, and in order to escape the noose, if you pay cash, you may be able to get a pardon. I would argue in these circumstances, all of these people are poor. And the text is there where the warrant is signed, and these be but mean men, means they have no money. And there's women in there as well, and there's lots of Gaelic Irish names. And the state here is pardoning people, even though they're Gaelic Irish, and they have no money, there's no profit to be had, but they're not willing to kill them as a result. Why? That's one I'm not sure about. That needs thinking, but it is happening. and people are commenting on it at the time. Occasionally, the state will allow and conspire with the public to negate the full force of the law. Why? That's an interesting question.
Maybe if state devises that law might be too brutal, so they will try directly to nullify its effects, to be not so brutal with community together, in which case they wouldn't destroy people that brutally.
Potentially, yeah. That's one of the points that we kind of make. In an effort to make the new common law, which is new to a lot of people in Ireland, to make it palatable, to make it acceptable, you can't make it too difficult. Do you know that you need to be careful how you go? Like if you bring in a new law tomorrow morning and you have a rigorous application of the law, it becomes instantly unpopular as a result. You're better off to bring it in slowly. There is no profit from executing the poor. When you execute wealthy people, you keep their goods, but executing the poor, as many of these people are, there's no profit to be had. So there's not an urge maybe to kill people as a result. Executing parents can leave children in the care of the community, which ultimately costs money. Do you know? So sometimes, and then there's the usual thing about a slightly more humane idea or a gendered approach to the law, which suggests that we shouldn't punish women as hard as men, because ultimately society thinks that women are constructed differently in their DNA and they shouldn't be punished in the same way. And that still exists today in society to the point. When we do see that death is the answer, death sentences are carried out when we see murders sometimes. That's the most common one. It's very rare around theft, unless you're a recurring or notorious thief, where people say you can't be cured or you can't be helped. But otherwise, it's mostly murders. Other felonies can end with a death sentence, but usually those executed are the repeat offenders who are incorrigible or notorious. And much like today, I think we are happiest when our offenders and our victims live up to our expectations of them. Gender, they need to be men, not women. Age, they need to be a little bit younger. The most dangerous thing in society's eyes are young men aged between 18 and 30. They're the people who cause violence, they're the people who cause destruction. I would argue that's the exact same people. If you ask, we always have, when we teach criminology in Ireland, we have two surveys that we introduce students to. One is the crime survey, which is a survey of crimes being carried out that are reported to the police. And that's all sorts of everything. And then we have a thing called a fear of crime survey. And the fear of crime survey asks people on the street, you know, people with a clipboard saying, are you scared of crime? What are you most scared of? What time of the year are you most fearful of crime? What time of the day or night are you most fearful of crime? Who are you most fearful of? And society is very, very interesting. The people who are most fearful of crime, any guesses?
Maybe young people that have their whole future ahead of them.
Not quite.
Women?
Okay, what kind of women?
Young women.
Old women. Old women tend to be the most, at least in Ireland, I don't know if it's the same across Europe. Old women are most fearful of crime. Do you know who is least fearful of crime?
Young men.
Young men are least fearful. Young men think they're bulletproof, that they can get away with anything, they'll always survive. Okay? Who experiences the least level of crime as a victim? Any thoughts? Old women. Old women are most scared but least likely to be victimized. Who experiences the most violent crime? Young men. Because they're out at night and they're, you know, sometimes engaging in activity where they might. So in that case, the people who are most fearful have the least amount of fear, and the people who have the most amount of fear are not scared at all. Do you know? So we need to be careful about those ideas, about perceptions of who are the victims of crime. So if you, as a male, are going to walk your girlfriend home tonight, you need to tell her she should be walking you home, because you're more likely to receive violence than she is. And that's counterintuitive, because we're grown up to think men protect women, men need protection, mostly from other men, I might add. But nevertheless, the perceptions of gender, age, class, ethnicity, regionalism, what part of the country you come from. We have perceptions in Ireland that people who live on the border are all smugglers. It's not true, but it's what people say. Do you know? Or that people from Roscommon are more inclined to steal sheep. Or that people from Cavan are very tight with money. All of these kind of, and we laugh at them because they're silly. But in a jury, sometimes may think, well, there might be a seed of truth at the back of their head. Do you know? Things like nationality, all of these will play a role in the execution. So I'm very nearly done. This is a case of somebody who is fighting, who is found guilty and who is executed. And there's some very important things. Something so horrid, so fully proved, and he had little to say for himself. So he's violent, he kills, and he doesn't have any good reason for it. He's not offended, nobody's sleeping with his wife, he's just a violent man who killed somebody. So he's got no excuse. There's nothing that he can say to convince somebody that he's due for mercy. And so he's got nobody that comes for him, so he's killed and he's executed for himself. Because the fact is so horrid, there's no doubt about the allegation that it's proven, and so ultimately he's little to say for himself. He is that young man who's violent and who society is happy to see go. If it was an old woman who killed somebody, she wouldn't be executed, I think. And again, that's because our society, by which I mean you, and we all conspire in this setup to treat people differently based on a whole range of issues of all sorts. The community, the judge, and the jury all agree that that guy is suitable for a death sentence because he fulfills the roles and the societal expectations of what a murderer is. Do you know? So think, you know, all the stereotypes of what a murderer looks like, what a rapist looks like, what a thief looks like, and we all have these perceptions, and lots of times they're wrong. Do you know? And I've got colleagues of mine who work specifically on things like domestic violence, and she would suggest that domestic violence is traditionally bidirectional, most commonly. Both partners are beating each other up. And where it's unidirectional, and this is where I was very surprised, where it's unidirectional, where it's one partner damaging the other partner, women more likely to be offending than offended again. That goes against everything that we're taught about, you know, from a societal point of view or a common conception of what domestic violence is. Do you know? Men only come out on top where the violence becomes extreme, and that's very problematic because people die. But on a lot of other levels, it's not what we think, because we have perceptions about things like gender, class. Do you know? Nobody thinks of a thief as being very wealthy, even though, as we found out during the economic crash in 2008, the people who stole the most wear suits and work in banks. And that's true. It's true, you know? Or to a point at least it is, at least. So, conclusions. Finally, I'll get to my point. Number one, the law, as remembered or written in the statute books, is very different to law that is actually applied in real life, in the community, on the ground. And that's quite potentially the same today. That just because it's written in black and white in a text, it's not always necessarily the case that that's how it will be in reality. And that's a good thing, because laws that's written down doesn't always take into account the circumstances of somebody's life or their background or the circumstances of the event that brought about their misbehavior. Almost all of the signs point to the idea that criminal justice system is not nearly as destructive as the law says it should be. So imagine if we didn't have all of these records and we just had the law, we would say early modern Ireland's legal system is very, very violent. In theory it is, in reality I think it's not. Beware of assuming that what we call in the 18th century the bloody code, this refers to a law code in England where the number of executable offences goes from about 50 in the Middle Ages to about 200 in the mid-19th century, or sorry, in the mid to late 18th century, that essentially you're hanged for almost anything going in the 18th century. And that's what people remember because it's what gets into the books. I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's oversimplified, not as violent as one thought, but assuming that Ireland must be equally as violent. And this assumption that as time progresses, humanity becomes better. I think in some ways, humanity is getting worse. I know that's not always a popular thing to say. I think we become more destructive in the 19th and the 20th century. We may live longer and we may talk the talk of human rights and all this sort of stuff, but we also have capacity for extreme violence in the 20th century, and there's no getting away from that. The things that humans do to other humans is disgusting in the 20th century, and the 17th century is not as bad in many respects. Although Ireland, and particularly the state, remains violent until at least the 1660s in terms of martial law, the triumph of the criminal justice system over martial law and popular involvement, the people actually, the community involved in justice provision seems to have had the effect of humanizing the state. So remember at the start I suggested about the state and the English would civilize the Irish. You could argue that instead of the common law civilizing Ireland and the Irish, maybe the common law civilized the state and state actors. That law, as it's actually practiced in reality with community popular involvement, actually makes the state a less violent place. That it civilizes the state and it civilizes the legal system. Politicians and state actors may eventually have also played a part. One Lord Lieutenant, the King's representative in Ireland, the head of the legal system and the head of the state generally, who's born and bred Irish, by the way, suggested that a reprieved man might be hanged later, but a hanged man can never be reprieved afterwards. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions, as many as you want. But I would say as well, if you've been listening and understanding, but if your English is not, if you're not as confident speaking English or asking a question, I'm happy to take it in Serbian and somebody can translate for me maybe.
Well, looking at the Irish market of the common law system in the it's obvious saying this system is such, we're not going to use this other than the colonial aspect, right? But was there an Irish alternative that they were pushing?
Yes. So the Irish alternative to the English common law is a legal system that we have evidence for as far back as probably the 7th or 8th century, potentially even earlier. And that system is called Brehon law. And Brehon law is a distinctly Irish, it's kind of similar to a civil system in Europe, and it basically is a system of torts, what in the common law system we call torts. So the basic idea is if a harm is done unto me by an individual, I can expect compensation from that individual. And in Ireland, we're not using coin at the time, so cattle becomes a sense of currency. And so you literally have lots of law tracks identifying potential torts or harms that can be done to somebody, and then the compensation payment, which is rated on the basis of the person's status within society. So if you kill a very senior person, you pay way more compensation than if you kill a slave, for example. A woman, less than a man. So depending on status in all sorts of ways. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that that's a good value. There had been talk when Ireland became independent in the early 20th century. One or two people said, let's bring back Brehon law. This would be great. But the idea that you can simply buy your way out of a murder or a rape or a violent act, I think is probably ludicrous. It's never seriously taken. But it was a system in Ireland in the early Irish and the medieval period that worked for Ireland, and it seemed to work okay. So even though Ireland was fragmented politically speaking, it was unified culturally, linguistically, and legally. So the law was all over the island of Ireland before the Anglo-Normans arrived. It was a sophisticated law code. There's vast tracks on things like the law of beekeeping and all sorts of other things in between. And it's something that works reasonably well. And then in the late medieval period, when the English do arrive, we get for a short time a thing called march law, which comes from the old German word for mark, meaning border. And it's a hybrid law that takes a bit of English and a bit of Brehon law, and it fuses them together. And it's a workable solution that where you have mixed people of mixed ethnicity or people living in close proximity to each other. The law essentially is just a way to solve problems. It's a way to stop violence breaking out. It's a way to make sure that all society know where they stand and know what they can reasonably achieve and expect from society. It's a set of rules. And these are just rules that work for that particular society. But come early 1600, one of the characters who I quoted, his name is Davies, John Davies. More than anybody else, he pushes for the extension of common law across Ireland and the ultimate destruction of Brehon law. because for him it's uncivilized. And English common law is the very mark of civility in his mind in the early 17th century. Do you know? So there is an alternative. Is it being actually used in reality in the 16th century? It still is to a point, yeah, but its days are numbered once the plantations arrive. There's no way it can be allowed to survive. Do you know? Thank you. Do you have?
Yes, I do have some questions, short one. I wanted first to say that it was rather pleasant class. Next, I wanted to say that it was logical for Irish to not listen to English system and to make it weaker, because I mean, someone has been reading you for 500 years. Who would have liked that person? There's not even a single person who would be able to like English at that point in time. Also, I remembered one fun fact from Breton law that you mentioned. I remember that once Ireland had sort of death sentence for a husband who failed to feed his pregnant wife, or was it taking of acids? As I remember from what limited I read about Irish history.
Yeah, generally speaking, it's there's some occasions where violence is the response in Brehon law, that there can be certain circumstances where hostages could be taken, where people could be blinded. And so I'm not an expert on that branch of medieval law, but from my limited knowledge of it, in some of the circumstances that you've described, that might be the case. But I think for the most part, up to and including murder, a lot of the time, the punishment is taking wealth off you and giving it to somebody else. Do you know? And it seems barbaric to us now, but it was used at the time. But I would say about your comments about the English, to a point, I understand what you mean. And you know, from the perspective of the 17th century, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I suppose I would argue that there are Irish people, particularly people who are Catholic but ethnically had been English back in the 12th century, but who are now just considered Irish or Catholic. And some of them do engage in common law, and some of them make excellent lawyers. And it's noticeable that in the final success of the English state at the end of the 17th century, when there's a series of what we call penal laws brought in to restrict the Catholic community, that Catholics can't attend university, or Catholics can't do this, or Catholics, they specifically target Catholics can't be allowed to plead in court. And I think that's because many of the Catholic lawyers in the 17th century, not many of them are Gaelic Irish, but they're of this hybrid nation, are in some cases brilliant lawyers, and that they can use the law and engage with English law to actually restrict the English state or to restrict the colonial community. And law can be used, even though it's not always necessarily their law, it can be used to fight a sort of a rearguard action in protecting the interests of their community as a result, you know?
Yeah, I understand your point, Professor. I just took that what could have caused less executions, and that per my limited historical knowledge of this region, was English. If it was the Irish law, maybe there would be a few more executions, because why would you execute your people for tyrannical laws made by tyrant who rules you and specifically targets your people? If there wasn't English at that time, I suspect there might have been more executions a year if it was Irish law that determined for some different crimes.
Yes, potentially, I suppose, in that what you're saying, if I understand your question correctly, that if it was just Irish people living on the island of Ireland, that they'd have been far more content to execute, because they're unwilling to execute is essentially a mark of national resistance.
Yes, that's how I see it. Yes, I don't say that they are violent, but I say that there would be more executions if there was not English system. This was protection of people.
It's possibly the same. Ultimately, it's a counterfactual question because we don't know. But I take your point. It is an interesting premise, perhaps, that could be the case. You know. Thank you. Yeah.
When the Slavs moved into the Eastern Roman Empire, they changed a bit of their laws to their their customs leaked into the Greco-Roman laws.
Right.
Could there be suggested that the Irish customs changed the common law system in more than the English like to admit.
Yeah. For the most part, I would probably say, to the best of my knowledge, no. However, there are a few very interesting points whereby in the early 17th century, for example, agreements made under a Brehon law, or Gaelic Irish system, an agreement made, was brought to a chancery court, which is an English court, and they said, we have an agreement, and the judgment came down that we constitute this agreement to be good contract. And so in this case, they are effectively acknowledging, now I'm not suggesting this is widespread, I've only heard of this happening once, that effectively this is something that could be allowed. In another circumstance, as late as the 1670s, a very peculiar, to me it seems peculiar at least, feature of Irish Brehon law called Cincóitheas. In English, in Irish it's pronounced Cincófocus, and it essentially means community or kin or family responsibility. So as a larger family group, the Irish don't engage in a standard nuclear family, mother, father, 2.5 children. They instead tend to have a wider family group where my surname, the Dennehy, lived in a specific region, and that family might have tens or hundreds of people in our wider kin group, cousins, uncles, aunts. If I misbehave and break the law, the rest of my family have to pay the compensation price if I can't be found or caught. Now, what happens with that is, on occasion in the 17th century in Ireland, there are some examples of Irish law being applied by English administrators against Irish families in that way, because they see it as an effective way of guaranteeing control of the Irish population, particularly in rural areas and mountainous areas that are, more rural, less controllable. And they're essentially using a law that they've been saying for the last 5 generations is uncivilized and not good law at all, and they're informing the Irish that they're going to enforce this law, which is Irish law, by an English state on an Irish population. And that effort of community responsibility, I think it's if there's outbreaks of violence in the rural areas, cattle being stolen, houses being burnt down, we're going to make something that's illegal in modern law, the idea of a community responsibility, like partisans who break down a bridge, all of a sudden the entire village is burnt out. It's that sort of level of responsibility, communal punishment, I suppose we might call it.
Yeah.
So there's not many examples of that, but there have been some examples of it. And that's, to my mind, is fascinating that happens, but it doesn't happen all that often, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Okay, great.
See you next time.
Yep, absolutely.